Hi, I'm Jim Purbrick, and I'm going to talk today about the art of social VR. I spent some time thinking about what the title should be for this talk. While there have been some studies of virtual worlds by people like Nick Yee and of social VR by people like Ralph Schwartz at Oculus and others, building social VR experiences is still new and currently more of an art than a science. To be clear, this is not a talk about artwork in VR. More the artistry required when designing and building social experiences. The slides do feature some amazingly artistic screenshots from Second Life, however, so if that's what you came for, feel free to ignore me talking and just enjoy the pictures. So 20 years ago, when I was working on my PhD in collaborative virtual environments, we would have called it multi-user VR, but I've never liked the term user, and the important word here is social. While we join a Zoom call, we meet in Second Life. While we can call each other using voice or video during the current pandemic, it has shown us that we all yearn to be together, and we can meet in VR in a way that we can't meet in a call. So just as VR can give us a feeling of presence, of being somewhere else, VR can also give us a feeling of social presence, of being with somebody else. So social experiences enabled by social presence have the potential to be the most important application of VR and XR technologies in the coming years. 15 minutes today will only allow us a very high-level overview of some of the questions that need to be considered when building social VR experiences, but hopefully this presentation will provide a useful starting point for discussion afterwards and during this conference and hopefully in the coming weeks. So for more detail and links to further reading, please see my blog posts at jimpurbrick.com. So probably the most crucial consideration in the design of a social VR experience are the avatars used to represent the people in that experience. This image is a screenshot of a Second Life avatar by Ella Penelopin. So during my PhD research, blocky, abstract avatars was all that was possible in real time using consumer hardware. But now we have to worry about whether making avatars too realistic makes them creepy or highlights the missing pieces. So people were able to recognize loved ones just by the head and hand tracking in the early Oculus toy box demos, and that was very exciting. But the lack of visible eyes or face movement in those avatars also made people scared of those avatars and made them appear angry, because normally if you talk to someone and their face doesn't move and their eyes don't respond to you, that's because they're angry with you. So we have to be very careful not only about what we track, but what we do for the things that we don't track, and how the combination of movements that are tracked and movements that aren't tracked kind of create a composite feeling of a person and convey emotion, even if it's not necessarily the intended emotion. So as a contrast to the Oculus avatars, which only showed the information that was being tracked by the people, Facebook Spaces avatars took another direction. They added faces, they added eye movements, they made the avatars appear more friendly, and they made them move in friendly ways by simulating the way human beings would behave. But that also made them appear inappropriate in more sober contexts. If you had an avatar that was constantly feeling happy and constantly smiling and constantly following your eye gaze, then sometimes it could react in strange ways if what you're talking about is not something which warranted lots of eye gaze attention, or lots of smiling, or lots of friendly movements. So there are trade-offs here. On the one hand, if you only show what you're tracking, you can end up with scary avatars. But on the other hand, if you make stuff up and you get your guesses wrong, you simulate emotions that don't exist in the context, then that can also be creepy and confusing and strange as well. So one of the questions we always used to ask people at Oculus was, do you feel comfortable in the virtual environment? Do you feel comfortable with the avatar that you have, and do you feel comfortable with the other avatars that represent other people in the environment? And there are some things you can do which are relatively safe. So lip movement can be relatively safely reconstructed from the voice audio. We can extract the phonemes, we understand how the phonemes are formed by the lips, and we can therefore reconstruct the lip movement from the audio, and so it's much less likely that we're going to guess wrong. Even though we are constructing lip movement, we're less likely to guess wrong and come up with lip movement that is inappropriate for the words that are being spoken. So this idea of comfort is kind of was central to the work we did at Oculus, and I think is a good way of thinking about this. Are you comfortable with your avatar? Not does your avatar look realistic? Do the avatars of the people you're with look realistic? But do you feel comfortable? Do they feel human? Is your communication effortless? And are you not distracted by the other avatars? In some ways, if all the avatars just vanish into the background, then you know you've done a good job, because people aren't noticing the things that are missing. They aren't noticing the things that are wrong. Another big question in designing a virtual world is how much control you give people of the avatars that represent them. Because on the one hand, you want people to kind of feel comfortable in themselves. You want people to feel like the avatar's representing them well in the virtual environment. But on the other hand, you might want to make a virtual environment that kind of feels in some way cohesive, and doesn't have some people being represented by clouds, other people being represented by chairs, other people being represented by tables, and other people represented by dragons. So there's a big trade-off, big question to be asked about how much do you control the appearance of people in the virtual world, and how much do people control that other people have? If you decide that people in your virtual world need lots of control over their appearance, then again the question is, how do you generate all the possible combinations, and how do you make it easy to for people to create the appearance that they want in the virtual world? And Second Life was interesting here because a lot of that work went into the hands of the people who used the virtual world. So there were some people in the virtual world who were very good at making clothes, at making avatar animations, and then they could create a huge marketplace where the people who weren't very good at creating those things could go and kind of get pieces and add them together, maybe combine their punk jacket with their ballerina tutu skirt to create a look that was theirs, but it didn't require them to do lots of 3D modeling. And so when you're building these systems, you have to think, how much control are we giving to the people in the virtual world? How are we making it easy? If we decide that we want to give people lots of customizability, how are we making it easy for people to piece together the appearance they want? Another question is what happens about identity? Are you allowing people to create a new identity in the virtual world, which is something that Second Life did? And one of the reasons it's called Second Life is because you could take on a completely different Second Life. Or are you requiring people to represent their identity in the real world? And there are trade-offs there as well, because if you're using it as a communication medium like a telephone, it's helpful to know who you're talking to. But if you want to let people explore different identities, explore potentially different genders, then that's a very powerful thing that you can do in virtual worlds as well. And actually, it's something that's becoming harder, because when audio was added to virtual worlds, it was much more difficult to explore different genders and different identities than it was with text-based virtual worlds. Now we're adding tracking information to that as well. It is much more difficult to represent yourself as a different gender, a different height, a different appearance than it was. It was much easier to be a tall, dark stranger in a text-based virtual world than it is to be a tall, dark stranger in a graphical virtual world, if you don't have access to huge amounts of clothes, and also if you're not allowed to have a different body shape to the one that you have in real life. So in some ways, the kind of triumph of Oculus Toolbox, which allowed people to recognize each other by body movements, is also restricting the amount of freedom that people have in virtual worlds in the future, because it's difficult to escape the way their body moves, and so therefore it's difficult to potentially be radically different to their appearance in real life. So if avatars are one of the most important aspects of virtual worlds, another one is the activities and the content and the environment of that virtual world. What is it that people are doing in the virtual world? And while it's possible to imagine that sufficiently advanced avatars and social presence are enough to make social VR ubiquitous, it is important to consider what are people actually doing there. So currently, successful social networks foster social conversation around content. So you post photos, videos, and posts to your to a social network. They appear in other people's news feeds. People can comment on those videos. There is conversation fostered around those social objects. And so the goal of this presentation is to foster conversation in the Q&A afterwards, and hopefully this in the session more widely, and then hopefully that will foster more discussion in the virtual corridors between sessions and gatherings afterwards, and so the conversation will continue. The idea is this is a social object that conversation will flow around in the same way that conversation flows around posts and social networks. In the real world, even unconferences, which expect people to bring their own presentations to a conference, have a framework to encourage social interaction. They often ask attendees to introduce themselves at the start and fill a grid of talks together before the conference starts. Even for unconferences, an empty room is not enough to create that kind of social interaction that they're intending to produce. So historically, successful commercial virtual worlds have invested huge effort in filling their worlds full of interesting adventures and quests for visitors to discover together. Activities are typically completed much faster than they can be developed, with games companies often spending 4 years to create 6 months of content that is consumed by the people that play the game. And so these game systems are designed to encourage collaboration and have enough downtime along the way for teammates and people who are collaborating to socialize on the way to the next chapter of the story. Eventually, the virtual world becomes a place to meet friends more than a place to play the game. And so it goes with real life theme parks. They don't have capacity for everyone to ride on the rides at once, and so the queues become as important as the rides. The conversation is as important as the content. And often games try to include an end game, which allows people to compete against each other once the challenge of competing against the environment has kind of had its way. And other virtual worlds like Second Life emulate the unconference model more, make it easy for people to build their own content and in some cases sell it. So whatever the model, it's unlikely that social experiences will be widely used without some content or activities within the world to draw people in, to break the ice and form the social objects around which conversations can flow. So social virtual worlds are often pictured in fiction or the imagination in these endless digital metaverses that spread to the horizon. And while this vision is extremely exciting, it's difficult to realize in software, and it's impractical. It's often not what you want. So Second Life became a seamless virtual world which grew to be the size of Denmark while I was working at Linden Lab. And while it was possible to fly over the world, it was clearly impractical. Teleporting became normal, turning this kind of endless space into a web of places that you would teleport between. And then people would link to them with blogs, and you would dart around. It would actually became a web more than a space. And so I encourage people to think about this model when designing virtual worlds of the future. I think the web linking to places in the virtual world, which then can link to each other, allows everyone's home to have all of their favorite places outside of the front door. You don't have to walk to the end of the road and then walk past the houses and then walk to the next thing, or just completely ignore the world and teleport to the thing that you want to see. So these are just a few of the things to consider when building social virtual worlds. Let's move to the Q&A. If you would like to find out more, there are blog posts which use all of the same screenshots and talk much more detailed, in-depth way at my blog, which is on jimpurbrick.com. Thanks for listening.